Great. Well, I think we can get started. As more people trickle in, um, we'll just continue onwards. So thank you for today's webinar with Dana Thomas. We're very excited to have you here, Dana. Before I introduce Dana, I just wanted to run over a few logistics. We'll do a sort of Q&A between Dana and I for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to participants. If you would like to ask a question, there is a Q&A chat box specifically at the bottom you'll see on your screen. And if you'd like to ask a question, please submit it there and not in the regular chat box, because that's where I'll be checking for questions. And then I will pass those along to Dana to answer. Great, so we'll get started. Again, thank you so much, Dana, for being here today. We're very eager to hear more about your book and your work. Just to get started, Dana Thomas is a fashion and culture journalist and an author based in Paris. Her previous books include Deluxe: How Luxury Lost Its Luster, and Gods and Kings: The Rise and Fall of Alexander McQueen and John Galliano. Today we will be talking about Dana's newly released book, Fashionopolis. I'm excited to kind of get the conversation started and learn more about the book itself. I've personally read it, but for those of us who on the call who haven't had the chance to read your book, could you just give us a brief description about what it entails?
Absolutely. So as it happens, I have props.
Wonderful.
So it's called Fashionopolis: The Price of Fast Fashion and the Future of Clothes. And actually, because I see this is here, I'll read you what it says. One
Wonderful.
of the fundamental questions we ask ourselves every day, and now more than ever, are what should I wear? And we are told it should be something new. The clothing industry turns out 80 billion garments a year and employs every sixth person on earth. Historically, the apparel trade has exploited labor and the environment and intellectual property. With the explosion of fast fashion, globalization, and the tech revolution, those abuses have multiplied exponentially and primarily out of view. So in this book, I have traveled the globe to discover the visionary designers and companies who have propelled us propelled the industry towards a more positive future to produce better fashion. I see a renewal of hosts and developments, including 3D printing, clean denim processing, smart manufacturing, hypo-localism, fabric recycling, and even lab-grown materials. We have been casual about our clothes. It is time to get dressed with intention. I wrote that, so that's why I figured I could read it.
Of course. No, it's fabulous.
So it's basically about that. I like to say that I used the book A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens as sorry, 1 second. I did not put on airplane mode, and I must put on airplane mode. There we go.
No problem.
As the sort of structure for my book. So it's divided into thirds. And the first third is the ghost of fashion past, which means, all the horrors, including the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and through the 19th century and all the things that Dickens wrote about in things like Oliver Twist and in great books like Oliver Twist, and, what Frederick Engels wrote about the condition of the working class in England. And then the middle section is what I call the ghost of fashion present, which is about sort of where we are today and how things are, some are good and some are bad. There's slow fashion, which is terrific. There is, right shoring, some movement towards better practices. And then the ghost of fashion future, which is all this really cool technology, 3D printing, growing leather in laboratories, growing silk in laboratories, all these different robots and sobots, and how, direct to consumer and IA, artificial intelligence and e-tailing, and how now we're seeing in the situation we're in with home with home isolation, how e-tailing is becoming even more important than I predicted in the book. And if we put our minds to it, we can make a better system. And it's not just about fashion. I mean, I write about fashion because we all get dressed in the morning. As I say, every day we ask ourselves, what am I going to wear today? But it's really about commerce. It's about globalization and the backlash to globalization. It's about the environmental movement. And this, I just use fashion as a way to explore all these different areas and human rights, because we can understand it far more easily than if I were talking about, and it's more sexy, let's be frank, than if I were talking about widgets, right? Or cars, or, some other, electronics, fashion, we can understand if I tell you this is how our blue jeans are made, that blue jeans were the most sustainable garment when they were invented, and we've turned them into the least sustainable garment today. And I explain how, you go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that the industry had sort of veered so far off course. And that's what I want to show. And it's not just the industry, it's business in general.
Well, thank you so much for that. It's great to hear and learn more about your work. And to talk sort of more about your work in developing this book and the topics that you've wrote about in your previous books, how did you get interested in sort of fashion luxury in the first place? How did you choose that as sort of your topic of choice?
Well, I had lived in Paris when I was younger, and I spoke French and Italian, and I'd always wanted to be a political reporter and be a White House correspondent. And I studied journalism at American University. And while I was still at American University, I got the most entry-level job you could get at the Washington Post. If you all have seen the movie The Post, the one with Meryl Streep playing Mrs. Graham and Tom Hanks playing the wonderful Ben Bradley, for whom I can luckily say I worked. There was a guy in that movie pushing around one of those big metal carts filled with packages and newspapers, and he was delivering packages to people in the newsroom, all the reporters. That was my job. I mean, I started out as low as like this was the bottom of the bottom rungs in the newsroom. I was a copy aide. In the old days they called them copy boys, but then when they got girls doing it, we became copy aides. And only then, after a while being a copy aide, did you move up to news aide. And then you could become eventually a junior reporter. It was like, I was like sorting mail and delivering packages, but I was hustling, and I hustled up to becoming news aide on the national desk. And I thought, we're on our way, right, to being a White House correspondent.
Yeah.
And then the fashion editor in the style section needed a new assistant, and heard that I spoke French and Italian, and I'd lived in Paris, and I'd been a fashion model, which is another story, but we're not going to go there. And she said, how many copy aides and news aides in the Washington Post actually know how to say Givenchy and know who Versace is? So, I got the job. And for me, when I've been a model as a teenager living in Europe, she basically tapped me and said, I want you. And I was like, okay. And I thought, do I want to work on the fashion desk? Not really. I want to be a political reporter. I'd worked on the Hill. And I always saw that whole fashion chapter of my youth as a way to pay for college. And then I left it behind. Like, I put it on a box, put it up on the shelf, and that was that. And only when I worked for Nina Hyde, did it make sense that, actually you can meld these two together, that you can cover fashion. I didn't want to be one of those fashion writers who wrote about, hemlines and shoe heels, shapes, and, what is the new pink or the new black? That was boring. But I love the idea that you could cover it like politics and business, because essentially it is politics and business. And that's what Nina taught me at the Washington Post, as opposed to if I'd been, working at Vogue or Harper's Bazaar. And so it made sense to me, because I was using those reporting skills that I wanted to use as a serious reporter, and actually am a serious reporter covering the news and the business of fashion, like any other beat. I could be covering, I always say, if I lived in Hong Kong, I'd probably be covering real estate, but I moved to Paris, so I'm covering fashion.
Well, that's wonderful. It's nice to hear your story and how you've kind of progressed from being sort of more of a political correspondent to now where you are. I think it totally makes sense. Here I am writing about,
initiatives put out by the UN, and I'm writing about human rights in Bangladesh, and I'm writing about science and cool tech in Silicon Valley. And, this isn't fashion like you would think about, like you see in Harper's Bazaar. This is real reporting, and it's real stories, and it's about, and for me, journalism in general is sort of recording history as it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I still do. And I'm doing it just on this beat, which is an enormous beat. I mean, the fashion industry today is about a $1 trillion. I put 2.4 billion dollars a year in sales. And that number's a year and a half old. And I've heard recently it's upping. It was until self-isolation and everything collapsed, inching up toward pretty close to 3 trillion. That's a gigantic business. It's an enormous global industry. And I cover it as if it is an important and enormous global industry.
I mean, it is, and it touches upon so many different aspects of society in terms of what you're saying, human rights and policy. And I think wrapping those all together is really important.
Environmental policy and climate and everything, economics, capitalism versus socialism, all of it. And that's why I call it Fashionopolis, because, we don't realize, but we actually live in a Fashionopolis. That everything around us has to do with fashion somehow. 1 out of 6 people on the planet work somehow in the fashion industry, be it, a sales clerk in Gap, or a cotton farmer in California or India, or somebody weaving silk in China, or somebody selling clothes in Bangladesh. All these different angles, and 1 out of 6 people. And of the garment workers, only 2% are paid a living wage. And the math for here is really basic. 98% of our goods are made overseas outside the United States. Only 2% are made in the United States now. 98% of the workers in the garment industry are not paid a living wage. There's, I was terrible at algebra, but those 2 trains left the station. I mean, I could figure that one out. The 2% that are paid a living wage, they're making clothes in the United States or in Europe.
It's such a crazy, stark difference in terms of working conditions and wage across the world. So thank you for highlighting that in your book and making it more of a reality. I should put my
headphones on. You might hear me better.
We're hearing you. I mean, I'm hearing you fine. I think hopefully everyone else is hearing.
Let's see if this is a little better. Is that a little better?
Yes, that is actually better.
Great. It suddenly dawned on me, maybe I shouldn't be shouting at my computer.
No problem. To kind of touch more upon sort of the sections of the book that you laid out in the beginning and what you've been talking about so far, what was the most interesting or least interesting to write about, and how did you kind of wrap up these different topics together? How did you kind of integrate them into sort of to make the book flow across, the different sections? Because again, they are
that was the hardest part. That was the hardest part. And in fact, at the very end, when we thought the manuscript was finished and my research assistant was like, we're done, this is good. And I read it from cover to cover, and I'm like, there's still something that's not working right. There's still something that's not working right. And she's like, oh, you have that look on your face. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to get all crazy. Like, these skills I learned at the Washington Post, where you can just tear apart your story, move things around, and it's okay. And maybe there's some blood on the floor, but it's going to be fine. And I did that. I took a chapter, like a day before I had to send the manuscript for good. I took a chapter and cut it all up. Oh, wow. I mean, literally cut it up. Like I printed it out and I cut it, and I started sticking it in other parts of the book. And I was like, oh, this goes here and that goes there. And I sort of joked to my assistant that it was like a mafia murder, and I was leaving body parts all over the manuscript. And once I did that, then it all flowed and makes sense. But it takes courage to do that. That's the hard part, right? But how did I get into it? It started really, funny enough, when I was working on my first book, Deluxe, which I just think I put back up on the shelf behind me. But my first book, Deluxe, How Luxury Lost Its Luster, is about exactly that, the luxury industry sacrificing integrity for the sake of profit. And it's also about, capitalism and globalization and commerce. And this book is a bit of a follow-up to that. And when I was on book tour for that book in 2007, I met the person who was somebody at Brooks Brothers, and he said, you know, we're about to open our first factory in the US in ages, and it's going to be in Long Island City, and we're going to be making ties. And I thought, and we're going to make all our ties in America. And I thought, that's really interesting. And then that same day, 2 other businessmen in the fashion industry in New York told me they were bringing or maintaining manufacturing in the New York area. And I thought, this is really interesting. I wonder if, you know, after years of offshoring, if it's starting to reshore. And so I started watching it, and it wasn't quite up to speed yet, but that was sort of what started me thinking about it. And I opened a file and put all my clips in it and kept, you know, whenever I saw something on the subject, I collected and I read it and I just noodled it a bit. And then when I finally sat down to write the proposal, it was time, because the reshoring movement had picked up speed. And then in that also had slow fashion come around, and the sustainability movement was happening. And I felt like this was all part of a major shift you know, there was a movement within the industry to try to change it to something that was a better business model than it had been for 250 years. And so it was, I thought, and now we see that clearly with the repercussions and the reverberations of self-isolation and confinement, is that, you know, certain business models that have been sort of gasping for their last, or companies have been sticking to the old way of doing things, are going down hard. Neiman Marcus is about to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Lord & Taylor and Gap are not far behind, and JCPenney. Old school retailers that just did not get with the program.
Right.
And weren't being modern about, being modern about how to, you know, keep up with technology and business today. And we're still doing things like Gap was sourcing everything overseas and paying workers too much, and having too many bricks and mortar stores, and not doing enough e-tailing, and, you know, like, just lost their mojo. And this sped it up. This sped it up.
And you hint at sort of the different kind of business models that reside in the industry. And in your book, you mentioned that sort of rental clothing is one option that can kind of boost the industry forward in terms of sustainability. Are there other models that you see now, so that you think would be, in addition to rental, would be sort of?
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole
important.
local is, and right shoring movement is going to pick up speed because of the impact that something like coronavirus, a pandemic, has had. You know, that it started in China, and then it moved to Italy, just like the Silk Road. Like, we're still following the Silk Road that's been going on for what, 1,000 years, right?
Yes.
So it moved from China to Italy, and then Italy to France, and then France to Europe, you know, the UK, and across the Atlantic to America. And so when all the factories were closed in Southeast Asia and China, you know, fashion businesses in the United States, even though they still had customers and stores were still open, weren't getting any products because things weren't being shipped. And then they had to close here, and you know, like the reverberation. Right. And now they want to open up, but maybe the factories aren't running yet in Italy, and the United States still could use some products, and then they're not shipping. And so I think you're going to see more reshoring and localization. Like, you know, Brooks Brothers, so smart. So they opened that factory that they told me about in 2007. And from one day to the next, they pivoted and made and announced, before anyone else had even like thought about it, they pivoted and stopped making ties and started making masks. And why could they do that? Because they own their factory. It was just on the other side of the river. They went over there. They're like, okay, everybody, stop what you're doing. Here, let's use this material. Let's start making masks and giving it to everybody who needs it. And, you know, meanwhile, other companies that were sourcing in Bangladesh, instead, what did they do? Because they don't own their factories and they subcontract everything. Right. They canceled orders and sent that country into an economic meltdown. And they got bad press. I mean, Ralph Lauren cut a check for $10 million, but does that save face? I don't really think it does. Brooks Brothers, meanwhile, got so much cred for that. It's golden. You can't buy the publicity that they got. It made that brand super cool again. It made you go like, Brooks Brothers, I hadn't thought about them for a while, right?
Right.
And so I think you're going to see more companies going, maybe we need to get a factory in Long Island City. So if there's ever a crisis in Asia again, or a health crisis in Europe again, or something, closes everything down, we aren't standing here going like, what do? We just keep working. And if we need to switch it up, we switch it up.
Right.
Being more nimble. I think you're going to see businesses become much more nimble. And if they can't, they're going to go down.
Yeah. And how do you see this affecting the existing supply chains of businesses, this reshoring, in terms of,
I mean, what's going to happen and what I hope happen, we'll see. Probably what they're going to do is yank all those jobs out of Southeast Asia, which, mind you, they said, oh, we're putting all these jobs in Southeast Asia to help lift these people out of poverty.
Right.
But meanwhile, as soon as the going got tough, they pulled out and threw them into a poverty that has never been seen, like the likes of which we've never seen before. Those people there's going to be a starvation. It's going to be awful. So, and they're paid $95 a month. I mean, the people making these decisions in offices in New York spend that on lunch. Right? It's just, my husband did say the book's a little bit Marxist, and it's a little bit Marxist. But, I like to think that everyone, especially after 30 years of rampant, unbridled, unchecked capitalism, which has made a wealthy class like wealthier than is even imaginable. That maybe like Tabasco, we do need like a little shake of Marxism, right? Just to like
a little flair,
balance it out a little bit. It can still, instead of being like this, and we bring it a little bit closer together.
For sure.
That the people making the decisions aren't spending more on lunch than the people they're canning earn in a whole month. Let's just shrink that down a little bit. So I'm hoping that won't happen. That probably will happen. What would be grand is if those companies decide to start the campaign Pay Up, which is on hashtag Pay Up on media, and they start paying their workers a living wage and they produce less. Okay, now it's going to mean smaller profits and less of a profit margin and smaller returns to shareholders, but they're still going to make a lot of money. They're just not going to make a grotesque amount of money. And they're not going to do it by, one woman described it to me recently, and I was like, you're right. She described it as, the modern version of colonialism. And this is just one step up from slavery. And she's right. Because these people are the workers are locked into horrible jobs that they can't get out of because they're in debt to the owners of the factory because they can't pay their own bills. And it's almost like servitude. So, what would be nice if a living wage is $200 a month, that they actually paid $200 a month and not $95 a month, and they didn't overproduce and have this surplus of clothes that we don't know what to do with. So we destroy 20 billion garments a year unsold, which is crazy, and just like rethink and recalculate and rejigger this business model based on volume. I think the future is direct to consumer, and I think the future is more and more made to order. And it can be made to order on a mass level. Like I've seen machines, which I write about in the book, where you can adapt through computers, a computer program, a knitting machine. So you don't have to order 100 red sweaters, even though you're only going to sell 80 and you throw 20 away.
Right.
And instead you can make a red sweater, then a purple sweater, then a green sweater, then a yellow sweater, then a green sweater, then a blue sweater. And it will, make the sweater to the orders. And then they go directly from the factory to the consumer. I think things like that is the future. Zero waste should be the future, because zero waste is better business. Right.
And on the topic of zero waste and sort of waste management in the industry, can you talk a little bit more about the people that you came across who are kind of bridging the gap between science, technology, and fashion?
Science, technology, and fashion. Well, yeah, the whole last third of my book is about that. And so there's wonderful, really cool people like Iris, as we say in Holland, but we say in America, Iris van Herpen, the fashion designer from Amsterdam, who was the first to 3D print a dress and is always experimenting with you know, she was working with Neri Oxman at MIT to do that,
Mhm.
but she's always working with really interesting people, collaborating and taking technology and fashion forward. Or my friend Michael Schmidt out in LA, who was the first to 3D print a pliable, malleable fabric dress, which he made for the burlesque dancer Dita Von Teese. And I explained the whole way that this is made in the book. And then there's, you know, the people in Silicon Valley I went to see called Bolt Threads, and they're growing silk in laboratories that mirrors how spiders spin silk.
Fabulous. Wow.
And it's all lab made, so you can make silk without killing silkworms, which for somebody like Stella McCartney, who doesn't want to kill animals for fashion, you know, this is fantastic. And also it just is, I mean, the silk industry, while it's been around since the dawn of time, is one of the dirtiest out there. And, you know, when it's been around since the dawn of time, but it was not producing to the levels and amounts that we do today. It wasn't industrialized. It was still an artisanal thing, but done by farmers. That's a different game altogether. So we could go back to having old school silk, but, you know, in a limited, because it was a luxury. It wasn't something mass consumed. And then they also have come up with a leather that they're growing in laboratories from the root structures of mushrooms. That's really cool.
Wow.
And that should be out in the world soon. And then I also visited another laboratory in New York. They're also now in New Jersey, called, oh gosh, what's it called? It'll come to me in a second.
No problem. Take your time.
It's the end of the day here. I'm a little tired. And they're making a what they call biofabricated leather, and which they grow out of DNA in vats of yeast. And you grow it to shape, you know, it's collagen, and you can grow it to shape. You can grow the amount you want. So again, zero waste. All these things that you're growing and making in labs, you grow to order. And so you don't have waste. One of the most amazing moments while researching my first book, Deluxe, I went to the Hermes Atelier to see how they make a Kelly bag from beginning to end. And they showed me these big alligator crocodile skins that were in the shape of the beast, dyed in like purple and turquoise and green and yellow, and polished and all set to be made for the bag. And the first thing that the artisan did and the first step of this transformation from skin to handbag was he looked at the skin for flaws and circled them with a grease pencil and then cut around them and threw the scraps away. And that sometimes didn't leave very much of that animal intact, because alligators and crocodiles are rather violent creatures that fight a lot. It's like, yeah, they do, don't they? And so when they fight, they bite each other, and then they scar each other, and then the scars get circled and cut out. And he said, but the same even happens with cowhide, because, you know, say they brush up against barbed wire, even a bug bites them and it leaves a nick in the skin, in the hide, right? So they cut all that out and throw it away. Well, when you grow it in a lab, you don't have those flaws. See, this poor creature isn't, even if you're not a vegetarian, you're not a PETA person and everything, you just think about this for a moment from like just humanity's sake. This poor creature is raised in this farm. He gets in a fight with his fellow tank mate in the crocodile tank. They kill him, they skin him, they tan, which is a horribly polluting process of the skin and the coloring and the dyeing and the pollutant, and then 3/4 of it winds up in the trash because you got in a fight with the guy in the tank mate. You just go like, there's got to be a better way, right? Well, the laboratories figured out a better way that's less wasteful.
It's wonderful to hear all these examples.
Kinder to humanity, kinder to animals.
Right.
Less, I think it's sort of less arrogant in a way.
Yes, for sure. And it's good to kind of see that there's movement in the industry to, rectify these types of practices and make it a better overall.
Modern Meadow. Oh, thank you. My readers, on the comments, somebody reminded me it's Modern Meadow. In fact, just
wonderful.
had like a blitz because I'm tired. Sorry.
No problem. Well, I'm glad we figured
I was
it
about
out.
to pick up the book and look it up. I was getting really worried about it.
Well, I'm just monitoring the time, and I've seen that there are a bunch of questions that have come
Yes,
in
let's take a couple of the
from
questions.
the
I also see comments here. Let's see. I'm going to go real quickly and just
Yes.
answer like a couple
Yeah,
of quick
go for
hit
it. Go
ones
for it.
here. Good morning, Iowa. And yes, I talk about used cloth and reuse. And yes, there's a Q&A. And more about what I think about the environmental impact is growing or shrinking. Well, it depends on how we come out of coronavirus, that doesn't it?
Yes, for sure.
Because I think it's not just the fashion industry, like everybody's impact. I've been hearing like the air in LA has never been cleaner ever since they've been measuring it. My friends say you can see the bottom of the Seine right now. There are dolphins in Venice.
Yes, I've seen the videos.
So I think it's up to everything and everybody about how we're going to impact the environment for better or for worse in the next few weeks. We can make some, the UN set all those goals and said, and everyone's like, we'll never make them, we'll never make them. Well, boom, in 4 weeks, we started hitting some of them, I think. Right? So I think it just proved that if we want to, we can.
For sure.
What kinds of policy interventions would enable fashion companies to be? Well, that's something. That's I think the subject of another book. But in short, I think that the fashion industry does need to be regulated. I'm not sure how, but I think it does. I think maybe it needs a sort of body at or somebody in Europe and in the EU. Sort of like WHO or like the UN, but at the EU setting some real basic standards that just must be met, just like we have for the airline industry, right? Some basic standards that must be met for safety and for well-being of humans and the planet. And if you don't meet them, then your products don't come in the EU. And sure, there'll be people who bypass and say, well, they don't have to do that for Brazil and they'll ship whatever they want to Brazil. But if we could like get at least a basic for the US and the UN, or the EU, that would change the way a lot of people do business, because it would cost them too much to come up with the for other markets. There's these are quick hits. Now tell me from the Q&A pile. I've not looked at those.
Yes. Okay. So one of the questions is, do you see companies focusing on sustainability like Patagonia, but at an affordable price point for the majority of people? How do you see this playing out as we move toward higher wages in the industry?
Yes, and yeah. First of all, one of the most important things that most people do not realize is that clothes have never been cheaper than they are today. And I kept hearing that when I was working on the book, and I was like, what does that mean? And then it dawned on me, sort of two steps. The first was that I was seeing how much my then 16-year-old daughter was paying for clothes. And I was thinking back to how much I was paying for clothes when I was 16 for kind of the same sort of things, like a Madras shirt from India and some Levi's. And, the price was, for some of the stuff she was buying was much less than I was paying in 1978, 79, and 80. Meanwhile, I was earning $1 an hour babysitting, and she earns $15 or $20 an hour. So that means she had 20 times the purchasing power. Well, what did that mean? She came home with bags of clothes when I would come home with one thing. And that's why we've seen a soaring rise in the amount of clothes we buy. We buy, 8 to 10, I think I had the figure of 6 or 8 times more clothes than we did a generation ago, but I think it's more than that. I think that's a really conservative figure. And meaning like, I bought one shirt, she buys 8 shirts every time we go out shopping. That's crazy for the same amount of money. And then I started reading a piece in the New Yorker from 1940 that talked about the price of clothes during the Depression, and they were the same prices they are today. And I was like, oh my gosh, during the worst economic situation, in modern history, the clothes were the same prices we pay today. And then I saw a pie chart, which I have to pull out and find, good old pie charts. We love those. And it showed, I don't remember where I saw it, but how much we paid for clothes out of our annual budget every year. In the 70s, and it was sort of, a decent slice. It was like that, right? And now it's like this. though we buy 6 times or 7 or 8 more times more clothes. The slice was a fraction, the sliver compared to a proper piece of pie. So that's for me the biggest, and we've become conditioned to think that clothes should be so cheap, and
Right.
that's the danger. So we should be paying more for our clothes. We should be dedicating more of our budget to our clothes and buying less and buying better. I mean, if you live in an old house or an old apartment, how big is your closet that was built in the 1920s or the 30s or the 40s? It's like this, right? And in the 20s or even the 1900s, those women were wearing dresses with bustles and petticoats and everything, and the closet was still this big. So, we need to buy less, buy better. So sort of get our head around the idea that, if you buy a pair of jeans that costs $100 or $150 or $200, it'll last a long time, and you don't need to go out and buy another pair in 6 months. My daughter wears my old Levi's 501 selvage jeans from the 1980s.
That's incredible.
Really cool.
Yes.
And it gives her really good cred. So, and those jeans cost more than she would have paid for some sort of hip, fast fashion jeans today.
Right.
And so I say, yes, you can. Then there's a whole bunch of startups, really cool startups that are finding ways to make nice, sustainable fashion, not expensive. I found I went to a pop-up in London before Christmas. I bought a beautiful tuxedo shirt for 120 pounds, which is like $150. And you go, okay, that's a lot of money. But this shirt is made of the most gorgeous cotton. Mm-hmm. It's beautifully designed. It's super beautiful fashion. It has bamboo buttons so that they're biodegradable and they didn't hurt the environment. And I mean, in the end, how much would that shirt have cost at Zara? Half that, and that shirt would last me 6 months max, and this one's going to last of my life. So, and every time I wear it, people go, nice shirt, because you can see that it's a superior product. So there are companies out there that are figuring out how to do sustainable fashion and not have it cost an arm and a leg. Yes, Stella McCartney costs a lot of money, but she's the first to say, hey, I'm a luxury fashion designer. Luxury's supposed to be expensive. But there are loads and loads of young brands and young people. This one I was buying from, this woman who had the pop-up, she used to work for Vogue, and she was like, I didn't want to do this anymore. I want to support all these cool young startups. And so she's doing these pop-ups all over London, and they're great. They're wonderful. Out there, and you can find it, and you can afford it.
Yeah.
We just have to get our mind around the idea that it's not normal to pay $2 for a bikini and $5 for a t-shirt and $20 maximum for a dress that we wear 3 times and throw away. It's not normal that it costs more to dry clean something than we paid for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, talking about sort of the quality and longevity of clothing, one of the participants asked the question, I was curious what your thoughts are on encouraging sustainable brands versus secondhand shopping.
Oh, I love secondhand. My daughter actually is totally into secondhand shopping now, which is great. And when we were on my book tour, we went to a Salvation Army shop, and she found 2 Ralph Lauren shirts for $1 a piece. Perfect condition. And I thought, right, this says so much on every level. Ralph Lauren is now considered so throwaway that it winds up at the Salvation Army. Mm-hmm. And it has so little value because of its massness in resale. It's only worth $1 when that shirt originally cost what, $120? Mm-hmm. So that shows you that when you're buying a lot of these things, you're not buying the product, you're buying the marketing, you're buying the image, you're buying the noise. But yeah, secondhand's great. I consign things all the time, and I buy things on consignment all the time. I'm actually somebody who wears things until they literally fall apart. My husband was mocking me today because I had a huge hole. And I changed sweaters for you all, but I had a huge hole in my elbow. I'm like, yeah, whatever. And like I said, my daughter's wearing my jeans from the 1980s. So, but I do consign from time to time, and I do, and I think that resale is great. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go for it. We should keep things in circulation. And I have a whole chapter in the book dedicated to the circular economy, which means that, since the birth of the Industrial Revolution, we've been consuming in a linear fashion, birth of a product, use of a product, death of a product. And the circular economy means birth of a product, use of a product, rebirth, winding down of said product, rebirth of the product, use of the product, rebirth of the product, use of the product. And it could be through recycling or regeneration. It could just be like, you take that dress and you turn it into a patchwork quilt, part of a patchwork quilt. It could be that you're doing visible mending. It could be that you're putting it in consignment. There's all different ways to keep that garment out of landfill, and that's what we should aim toward. We should never throw clothes in the trash unless they're like really, really, really ruined.
Right. And do you have solutions of your own that you've been using to kind of discard of clothing in a sort of sustainable manner?
Some of it, if it's organic, like it's
right.
The other beauty of that organic shirt that I paid $150 for, or 120 pounds, is, the day that it does wear out, because it's organic, then I can put it in the compost and feed the rose bushes.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know that, it's all, or go in the vegetable garden and it's still organic. Let the worms sort of,
yes.
I give, when I give to charity, I try to make it, I don't just like dump everything to the Salvation Army. You can do things like give to specific projects, like at our church when we had a collection we have a collection every year for orphans at Christmas. And we see the trucks drive away and take it to the orphanages. And we have collections for, when there's a problem, like when there was the floods in Haiti. And then homes for battered women, because when those women leave home, they leave with the clothes on their back and nothing else.
Right.
And if somebody could use a new dress, it's a woman who just left an abusive household.
Mm-hmm.
And same also with like makeup, not used makeup, but say you have stuff that, you've been given like swag and you don't know what to do, always send it to the Home for Battered Women. Fantastic place. They're so thankful. They are so thankful. Like, you got a bag full of like nail polish and you don't wear nail polish, or some mascaras that were handed out, give it to them. They'll love it. And
great initiative, for sure.
And then also, just doing things like, even if it's just cutting it up and turning it into rags and then using the rags to polish the silver, like anything to just keep it going until it can't be gone anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but
wonderful.
Try to share it, and swapping. My daughter swaps with her girlfriends. She walks in the kitchen and something new. I'm like, what's that? Oh, it was Maya's. Okay.
That's a great initiative too. Yeah, I think that's definitely something, and maybe that Gen Z
they swap all the time. It's great.
Yeah. Gen Z will keep doing, hopefully.
Shop your closet, shop your friend's
exactly.
closet, shop your mom's closet.
And your sisters, if you have any.
Exactly.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you for those little anecdotes and ways that you're trying to make better sustainable path forward. It's great to hear from.
Today I'm wearing a sweater made out of recycled cashmere, which means that it's all the offcuts from when like a beautiful luxury cashmere company is making cashmere sweaters, then stuff falls to the floor, and this company collects all that and uses it to make sweaters.
That's wonderful.
Zero waste.
Awesome.
And over it, underneath, I have an organic cotton shirt made with cotton that was grown in Alabama and handpicked and woven. So you see.
Yes. It's wonderful to see it.
It's possible to do.
Yeah, for sure.
This is by a company called Riley Studio in the UK. RILEY Studio.
Okay.
Look them up. They're very cool.
Great. Thank you. I'm just going to continue going through some of these questions here. We've had a lot come through. So thank you all so much for sending in your questions. There's a question on working conditions and human rights. Let me just read it to you. 98% of workers not being paid a living wage is saddening. In the last decade, have you seen the working conditions and human rights for workers improve or decline? This gentleman is from India and sees lots of people here claim that working conditions in Bangladesh are not as bad as they were a decade ago. Is that true?
It depends. It depends where you are and what you're doing. After the collapse of Rana Plaza, as I talk about in the book, the brands were shamed into doing something because the PR coming out of that was so horrific. That was on every front page in the world. 1,000 people, more than 1,000 people, 1,100 people died in that factory collapse in Bangladesh. So they got together, and this was just less than a year after there was a big fire that took more than 100 lives, also in Bangladesh. So they got together and started a binding agreement called the Accord for Fire and Safety, where they went in and it was legally binding and set about upgrading working conditions in factories so that there was fire exits that weren't locked. There were safety standards that were met. Wiring was put back up in the ceiling and not wires dangling around. There's no smoking. And I visited one event and I describe it in the book, you know, people cleaning all the time, that the team leaders, when there is a problem, wear fluorescent vests every day so you can always find them. They practice their drills. And on this one factory I visited, they even had their own water pump and cistern to put out a fire. You didn't have to wait for the fire department to arrive. They had the water on at their location. So that made huge differences in legitimate factories. But then there's, you know, bazillions of sweatshops, and the contractors subcontract and subcontract, and you know, halfway around the world you have no idea where your clothes are being made as a brand, and you lose track of your supply chain, and rightly so, because then you have sort of plausible deniability to when something does go wrong. Well, you know, Walmart was found to be making things in Rana Plaza, and they said we had no idea it was subcontracted. And meanwhile, they were, you know, everybody was making money off of that. So it did get better, but now the Bangladesh Manufacturers Association wants to get rid of the Accord. I'm not sure if they have or not with all that's going on. It was supposed to happen like any day now. And they want to take over monitoring. And that for me feels like you're just going to slide right back into where they were before. Because these were the people that were in charge before the Accord, this association, this binding agreement came together with more than 200 brands to say, you can't do that anymore. We're going to come in and watch and make sure you're doing things right. And so we'll see. I'm a bit skeptical about all that.
And why would they get rid of the Accord?
Because it costs money to put wires in ceilings and train people and put in pumps. And that's money that the factory owners would rather put in their pocket. That's what I was talking about, that little dash of Marxism that we need. A little bit of socialism, a little bit of regulation, because otherwise it doesn't get done and everyone just pockets the money that should have gone toward it. Corruption, just corruption and greed.
It's saddening.
And that's why I said I write about the fashion industry. I could be talking about anything. I could be talking about diamonds. I could talk about cocoa and chocolate. I could be talking about cotton farming. I could be talking about, you know, anything. Telephone building, making telephones, making sneakers, making anything, you know. If you don't have to put in safety measures in your factories and you can build a shoddy place on the cheap and pay people nothing to make everything and pocket all the profits, you do.
Course, yeah.
That's why everybody offshores, because there's no regulation.
Yep.
There's no oversight, and they're not held accountable, which I detail in that first third of the book, where I talk about the ghost of fashion past, but it's not so past.
Yeah,
there's sweatshops. I visited sweatshops in LA, downtown LA. You know, they're everywhere.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I think that's sort of a fascinating topic that you bring up in the book, is that we think of this, you know, all sort of as not happening in the US, but, you know, a lot of it does. So just to hear your thoughts about that would be nice.
Well, yes, in downtown LA, in the heart of LA, you have these sweatshops. I mean, as I have in the book, you can walk down the street and hear the sewing machines going, and they're run by filled with people who are, you know, don't have papers, aren't registered to work with the state, desperate for money. Sort of like, you know, in California, you have this whole economy like that. That's a cash economy, and it's, you know, gardeners, it's housekeepers, it's home caregivers, and sewing machine operators in underground sweatshops. And you have a lot of, you know, LA is the fashion capital of America. You think it would be New York, but everything during the offshoring era went overseas, and so there's very little manufacturing still in New York City, and the garment districts being turned into, those old warehouses are being turned into these amazing multi-million dollar apartments and condos. And so LA's got this huge industry and has a lot of brands that are based there. True Religion just filed bankruptcy, but they were based there. Forever 21 just filed bankruptcy. They were based there. Ross Shoes for Less, is that what it's called? Ross. Payless, there's a bunch of LA-based companies, fast fashion and otherwise, and jeans companies too. And their clothes are subcontracted to these sweatshops, but because they're made in LA, they get the Made in the USA label. So you buy it and you think, oh, it's made in the USA, so I know I'm not supporting sweatshops. And you actually know nothing. Made in the USA, made in wherever means nothing. There's sweatshops in Italy, and it's basically made in Italy, but it doesn't tell you how it's made. And that's what I think we need in labeling, is how something is made. And we're going to get that through tracking and through blockchain. Just like, when you lose your suitcase now, you can find it, you can put a tracker on it. Well, we're going to start doing that, I think, at some point with manufacturing of clothes. They were testing it before the coronavirus lockdown. And I think that that's really interesting, because then we'll know how our clothes are made. We can follow the supply chain from beginning to end, from the sheep to the store, from, as we say, field to frock, and or dirt to dress. And I think that's cool, because then we'll be able to hold these brands much more accountable, or just not shop at the ones who don't provide such transparency.
Right. Well, that's wonderful to hear. And I know a few brands, smaller brands, who are working on blockchain integration, more so on sort of the resale side, so helping more the brands. But I think there would definitely be integration from the back end as well.
A couple listeners said it's Ross Dress for Less. That's
there we go. Yes,
exactly.
Well, I'm just finding the time. We have about 5 minutes left, and given that we're in a tough situation now with the coronavirus and working from home environment, there's one participant who asked the question, how much do you think the movement towards working from home is going to change consumption of fashion in the post-COVID world?
A lot. And in fact, I just wrote a piece yesterday on this for British Vogue.
Wonderful.
And I might actually have it here, and I can paste it into the comments.
Great.
Let me find it. Vogue. There it is. Now we want it to go here. And can I make it work? Always making a terrible noise. But here, I could do it this way. I just wrote about this for Vogue, and I think two things I think are going to happen. I think it's that we're going to carry on this casual way of dressing somewhat. And at the same time, when we go out, we're going to want to dress really nicely to go out, because we'll be like, oh my God, we're finally going out. We're going out to dinner night, and I'm going to wear that dress I haven't worn in 6 months. I'm going to shop my closet, and I'm going to wear that dress because I haven't seen it in so long. And then I think we're also going to buy less and go to stores less, because we've gotten really used to ordering online and having things delivered even more than before. But I think we're just going to do with less. I mean, all this time at home has given us time to sort of reevaluate our values,
right,
and our shopping habits, but also clean out our closets and go, good God, I had no idea I had all this stuff. So I think we're going to do with less, because we've learned that we can do with less. And I think, at some point we'll gear ourselves back up to everything. We'll get back to the amount of traffic we had before. We'll get back to the amount we've been shopping for, but at least it'll be a slow climb back up there. And we will have had this break where we could reset stuff. And, I think there are going to be a bunch of brands that go under. There are going to be a bunch of department stores that go under. And hopefully there will be a rise in localism and in slow fashion sustainability, and that we'll sort of be thinking we'll be more conscious in our consumption habits and responsible.
Yeah, hopefully.
That's my wish.
Yes. And just to close it off, what is one piece of advice you would offer, students who are entering the market, or professionals who've been furloughed or laid off, is there anything you could offer?
Well, here's two things. First of all, I'm going to tell you, as consumers, when people ask me, like, what can I do as a consumer immediately, starting today, to just make a positive impact on the environment? And that is really simply wash your clothes less. Wash them a lot less, not just like often, although you don't wash your jeans so much. They really don't like to be washed. They were originally the most sustainable garment. They were invented to be sustainable and never be washed. So we wash them after wearing them once. It's just like, what? It's like putting your grandmother's silver in the dishwasher. Just don't do it.
Don't do that.
Don't do it. But when you wash your clothes, use the short cycle and use cold water. They will still get clean, and you will be using less energy, less water, less soap. Your clothes will be less beat up in the spin cycle. You'll be releasing less microfibers, which is a whole subject we didn't even get into, but I describe in the book. And I don't remember the figures, but I cite them in the book. But the impact of just that is enormous. If I'll just do that, it's enormous. For business, I would say, think about being independent, think about going with startups, think about working, think grassroots rather than big corporations. The companies that have done really well through this are the ones that are small, independent, zero waste, not in debt, nimble. And if you're in a small, independent, nimble company, it will weather through these disruptions that we're having more and more often. I mean, the last one was in 2008. Before that, it was SARS, and then it was September 11th, and then it was the crash of '89. They come up.
Right.
If you're a big corporation, you just sort of can't, and they've gotten too big. They can't adjust, and you're just not treated as well. There was a really interesting story by a woman who worked for Sephora in Texas, and it was on the front page of the New York Times this week saying, "I worked for Sephora. They never treated me they never treated me well." Well, of course not. They're a gigantic corporation, and you're just a pawn in this huge thing. When you're working for a small company, you get involved. You actually have a lot of responsibility. You understand how things work, how things are made. You know who your customers are. Think small, and think local. And don't think about, you don't have to be in New York City or Los Angeles. Like, one of the most interesting companies I wrote about is in Florence, Alabama. And they have a really great business. So, and you can have a good life. And I think part of our self-isolation is also realizing you can have a good life wherever you are. You don't have to be at the center of the hubbub. And you can have more impact, I think, that way. Honestly, I think you'll have way more impact being a big fish in a small pond than trying to be
thank you so much.
many in the gigantic global corporation that will never change because they don't want to.
Right. Sorry, I think you cut off. My internet is a bit unstable right now, but
they cut us off after an hour.
I think we still have like a minute or two, which should be okay. But I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with all of us.
My pleasure.
And for sharing your,
and now
your advice.
I'm going to be like a game show host. Fashionopolis, the price of fast fashion and the future of clothes. You can get it on Amazon, Penguin, Barnes & Noble. Look at independent retailers. We love to support independent retailers. I know, for example, I spoke for Revolution Books in Harlem. They have it on their website. You can order it from them.
Wonderful.
And they're in Berkeley too.
Great.
Everyone, do well, study well, finish your school year as sanely as possible. And thanks for tuning in.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful week. Bye, everybody.
Bye.